And we are talking for this week's political update here on the Atlanta News First Digital Desk with one of our amazing experts throughout here in Metro Atlanta on politics and government, Dr. Benjamin Taylor, political science professor at Kennesaw State University. And really, we appreciate your time. This is kind of a last minute edition political update for this week because this is airing obviously on Wednesday. 2 days ago now, the Georgia General Assembly marked one of the most important days in its legislative calendar, that being crossover day, the last day in which bills have a chance to pass one chamber in order to be considered by the other chamber, either the House or the Senate, before adjournment. And Dr. Taylor, just looking at crossover day, just kind of give me your overall thoughts. Were there any surprises that you saw, actually any legislative measures that you were expecting to pass and but didn't pass, or some that you thought might not be successful and yet did make the cut earlier this week?
Those are great questions, Tim. And, it's always difficult to predict what will make it on crossover day and what won't. And of course, the issue with crossover day is that we call it crossover day because this is by the rules of the House and Senate. This would be the day on the legislative calendar where there wouldn't have to be any special accommodations made for a bill to make it through the other chamber before the end of the session. Of course, if there are special circumstances, the legislature, particularly if a bill has perhaps not been voted on, and there, of course, there are rules about, where in the process the bill can be. But under special circumstances, bills can come back from the dead, so to speak. And so it is interesting what happens on crossover day. But some bills that I thought that would have gotten a little farther along that maybe didn't make it out of one chamber or the other for crossover for day were particularly the bill dealing with the Okefenokee Swamp. There was a bill that was there have been mining companies that have tried to get to the Okefenokee or area around the Okefenokee Swamp in Ware County. And the bill that would have protected the Okefenokee Swamp was not successful. I thought that might have gotten a little better attention, just because the Okefenokee is a popular place for tourists. It's important for South Georgia, and of course, the environmental impact of the Okefenokee can't really be overstated. Similarly, the Buckhead City movement that seems to crop up every year for the last few years, I thought it had some momentum, only to have the governor's office really begin to whip against it, and it got voted down in the Senate. And sports betting again. So sports betting has become very popular across the country. Georgia, while being sort of an early adopter of the lottery, which was sort of an outlier for other southern states, Georgia is not a leader on sports betting. A lot of states, North Carolina, for instance, has sports betting. Georgia does not. And so I thought the sports betting may get a little bit farther down the line, but it did not either.
And sports betting was one of the top issues we were looking at on Monday as crossover day got underway and the General Assembly convened. What were some of the factors behind the defeat of that movement? It almost seemed like it was an idea whose time had come. There were so many hundreds of millions of dollars that could be generated, and yet lawmakers were not even willing to put the issue on a ballot to allow voters to choose for themselves. What's
Right.
the future of sports betting, and really why did it fail?
Well, it's tough to say without being in the legislature, which I'm not, and not privy to the lobbying that was going on per se. But what I can tell you is, generally speaking, when the lottery, we ever think back to how did we get the lottery in the first place? We got the lottery because at the time, Governor Zell Miller wanted an issue that he could use to benefit, to both sort of produce more incomes, taxes for the state, produce more revenue for the state, to get more higher teacher salaries expand kindergarten and pre-K, and of course have the Hope Scholarship. And so the lottery was the vehicle to do that. So you had this policy opportunity in a lottery, and a politician at the time who wanted to capitalize on that, and pretty much, to use the betting analogy, put all his chips on the table. I mean, if the lottery had failed in Georgia, there's a very real chance Zell Miller's governorship is over by the second year of his first term. And so it passed. He got a big political tailwind out of that. The lottery has been very successful. And so what you're looking for in Georgia, I think, is because the same people who lobbied against the lottery are lobbying against sports betting. It's a confluence of interests who have economic interest in keeping this kind of thing out of the state. It's other states who already have sports betting who would like to have Georgia not do it, right? Because there are a lot of people in Georgia. Georgia is a very wealthy state. So why not, if you're a sports betting owner in North Carolina, you would just rather have people go to North Carolina to do it. So I'm sure there's some of that lobbying going on. And to be sure, there must be a large component of social conservatives, religious conservatives, evangelical Christians who are very, very much on the forefront of lobbying against sports betting. And they're being very successful, mainly because this is my theory and my sort of what I see going on. There's not yet a politician who wants to use sports betting as the vehicle to advance some serious policy agenda. Governor Kemp obviously did not have the interest in doing such a thing. We saw how powerful Governor Kemp could be. He's basically gotten everything he's wanted to have happen in the last few years, in his first term and now into his second term has been happening. Things he does not want do not happen, like the Buckhead City situation. So my sense of it is that Governor Kemp is relatively ambivalent on sports betting, and the result of that is that it fails.
Now, this is the first year of the 2023-2024 General Assembly. We have another session coming up, or the second part of this session coming up next year. Is there a chance that sports betting, Buckhead Cityhood, some of the other movements that failed could be revived, or are we done for this entire 2-year legislative session?
I can't speak to the specifics on that. It would depend on the nature of the defeats. So, and it would also depend on the rules, the assembly rules on when you can bring things back up. So I can't speak definitively, but the reality is this, that any legislative body has rules, and they are to be abided by and respected. And one of the main things that they can do with the rules is change them. So if there is a groundswell of support for any of these policies that didn't make it through this year, they can come back next year. They may be slightly different. They may be different in nature or different in some sense. But if sports betting is something that there's a groundswell of support for, and politicians begin to feel the burn from their constituents, and some 1, 3, a dozen of them feel like the time is now, then it can come back.
We are talking on this week's political update for Atlanta News First Digital Desk with Dr. Benjamin Taylor, professor of political science at Kennesaw State University, talking about crossover day. We talked about a couple of measures that did not pass. I'd like to talk a little bit about some of the ones that did.
Yeah.
One of the most notable that we've been following is a measure that would allow parents to claim a $6,000 voucher if they were to withdraw their students from a lower rated school. Some are saying that this could open up to some constitutional challenges if it is passed. What are the mechanics and the issues revolving around this?
Well, the big issue is that I can't speak to the specific constitutional aspects, as I'm not an attorney and I'm not familiar with that necessarily. But the big issue is that, just from a political point of view, is that Georgia has for some time allowed tax deductions for tuition, for private school tuition, which is a type of voucher in a sense. The difference here is that this would be a straight out, as far as I can tell. Now, I could be wrong about the details here, but as I understand it, this is for just a straight out $6,000 check that parents can use for private school tuition that would come from the educational funds that normally go to counties. And so that, I think, may be the issue. Georgia has, in the 1983 Constitution, Georgia has a constitutional right to an education for all children. And so the issue would become it was one of the issues anyway, is that if you are setting up a mechanism that would by default effectively cripple public education in this way, does that violate the constitutional guarantee of a public education? Because there, you could imagine where some counties are so hamstrung by this, by sending out $6,000 checks to families who send their kids to private school, that it becomes very difficult, if not impossible, for them to actually provide the public education that they are required to provide by the Constitution.
A couple of the other issues that we've been following that seem to have a pretty strong either political or social conservative background to it. Looking at a bill that passed the state senate on Monday, crossover day, that would prohibit some surgical procedures for minors who are experiencing what's been diagnosed as gender dysphoria, minors who believe they're transitioning from their assigned gender at birth to
Mm-hmm.
what their actual gender identity is, perhaps uh, ban or prohibiting some surgical treatment and hormone replacement therapies, and yet still allowing puberty blockers, as I recall. Is this movement sort of rooted in a more social conservative political philosophy?
I think so, and I think this really the first, at least to my knowledge, the first sort of large, sort of I shouldn't say large, but the first significant attention given to this issue was probably in North Carolina in 2017, 16, 17, 15. And that actually cost that former governor, Pat McCrory, it cost him his reelection to Roy Cooper, who's the governor of North Carolina now, in 2016. And since then, there was sort of a lull in that for a while. It was called the bathroom ban because it was dealing with bathrooms and whether gender assigned at birth, you had to go to the right bathroom. And so then that sort of was and then I think it came back on the scene about 2018, 19. And a lot of this is because there's a lot of attention being given to transgendered issues in more recent years, and just generally speaking, sort of like the contours of culture wars in the United States evolve over time. So I think that it's correct to say that the limitations on these things, on these methods of care and medical procedures are certainly coming from what I'm saying is the limitations on them are coming from a socially conservative point of view. But the issue itself fundamentally is one of medical care, specifically for minors. And this, I think, can be sort of lumped in with other issues of medical care like abortion or any sort of parenthood planning issues that are sort of very much at the fore of cultural conservative issue concerns. And as we've seen with things like the heartbeat bill last year and other bills to limit abortion access and other sorts of healthcare of that nature, this is sort of in a similar vein. It's a different type of healthcare. It's a different set of issues, but it's a similar idea. And so I think that conservatives generally think that it is within the purview of the state to regulate these things pretty significantly, whereas liberals don't. And so I think that's a real sort of dividing line. And to the extent that it's being used sort of nationally, I think my sense from a political point of view is that Republican advisors think that this could be a good wedge issue because, of course, there are Democrats who these issues of transgender care or abortion access, whatever, they don't cut cleanly along ideological lines, and so or partisan lines for that matter. And so it could be potentially it works as a nice wedge issue, this much the same way that same-sex marriage did years ago, to sort of cleave off or at least create some cross pressures for voters who might vote for Republicans or Democrats, but now given these issues at the fore, they say, well, wait a minute, I thought they were I thought Republicans or Democrats thought about these things in this way, but now I'm finding they think about them differently, and I bet I'm trying to figure out where I stand. So anything that a politician or political party can do to create those cross pressures and make voters think for a few minutes before they decide to vote for the party they typically vote for, that's a political win. On the other side of this is the very real consequences of these decisions, which have very real policy implications and the daily lives of citizens. And so, but this transgender care bill that's before the Georgia legislature, there are similar bills in a number of states this year, and so that's part of the process is sort of taking a bill that's sort of a framework and then using it in a bunch of states at the same time.
You were talking about really partisan wedge issues. One issue that has a distinct judicial angle to it, and yet does seem to be somewhat divisive, I should say, was a bill that was reported out of the General Assembly. I can't remember if it was the House or the Senate that would provide some sort of oversight or discipline for local elected district attorneys who
Right.
might be seen to be engaging in a little bit of prosecutorial overreach. Sometimes I look at that issue and I wonder, and I'm asking you, is this an issue that is really deeply rooted in the Fulton County District Attorney's Bonnie Willis's investigation into alleged 2020 presidential election interference by then President Donald Trump? Did this come out of a sense of outrage over this?
I think, again, I think reading the tea leaves, I would think that it did, just because there have been prosecutors who across the state of Georgia who are good at their job, some who are less good at their job, some are more professional than others. I mean, there are all kinds, right, all over the state. And of course, prosecutors have prosecuted elected officials, state elected officials, local elected officials. That's not new or different. But it is notable that in the aftermath of the Fulton County investigations regarding the 2020 election interference, alleged election interference by the Trump folks, that this is all happening. And while there are ongoing, still to be decided situations with that grand jury, where it's not done yet, and so. So yeah, I would imagine that this is a large part of it. Of course, there could have been, maybe this was bubbling under the surface for years and it just didn't make it into the news or make it into a high profile legislative action. But yeah, it does look like this is in some sense sort of retribution, or at least with attention to the Fulton County activities of the last year or so.
We're talking in this week's political update on the Atlanta News First digital desk with Dr. Benjamin Taylor, professor of political science at Kennesaw State University. Looking forward, we only have a few more days in the legislative session, I believe, according to the schedule that leaders published earlier this year in January. We're looking at an adjournment or sine die on Wednesday, March 29th. What are your observations, predictions for what will make it out of the General Assembly between now and March 29?
Well, that's a great question. And one of the things that we haven't talked about yet, but it's important, is that the legislature is only constitutionally required to pass a budget. Mm-hmm. And they have passed the supplemental budget for the rest of the fiscal year 2023 fiscal year budget, but they have not yet passed the House, to my knowledge, as of this time, when we're talking now, they have not passed the fiscal year 24 budget, which again is their only constitutional requirement. They could pass that and walk out the door, and that's all they got to do, but they haven't done it yet. And so that's another example of why crossover day is important, because of the calendar and the nature of the legislative rules. But this bill, the budget hasn't passed, and it's going to pass. It has to pass. There's no alternative but to pass it, or they'll be in violation of the Constitution. So, but that's the first thing they have to do is get that. Although I did see reporting that I believe it should be tomorrow. I believe they should be reporting on that. So, but in any event, it is always difficult to tell. I would think that there have been some other bills that got passed, like the truck weights, right? That's an interesting one, I think, because, as at least in my experience driving on Metro Atlanta roads, they're in need of anything that can make them better, and heavier trucks is not one of those things. So that's an interesting one that could probably run upon the rocks in the other chamber. Some other, I think the transgender care bill is probably going to make it out. Probably the prosecutorial oversight. There are some others. I was just noting the income tax rebate, right? That's probably going to be a good thing, good to go in the legislature. So, but some of these, like the renters' rights bill or the electric vehicles bills that are out there, those are the kinds of things that might come back around next year. Maybe. I mean, if they don't make it out this year, they'll come back. So those are the kinds of bills that get tricky because they're very technical, right? And maybe one chamber had a good amount of time to deal with them, but the other one feels like they're being rushed. And so they just say, no, we're going to table this because they have to do other things that are important, like pass the budget. And so that's the kind of thing that gums up the works at the end. And of course, there are always bills that get passed at the very last minute that you never saw coming, that were supposedly dead, and then all of a sudden they're back and they get passed. So, but it'll be exciting. It always is.
It is. It's an exciting time to be covering politics in Georgia. And as we wrap up this edition of Political Update for Atlanta News First Digital Streaming Desk, I love talking politics with Dr. Benjamin Taylor, professor of political science at Kennesaw State University. There's one other issue that's kind of on everyone's mind, and only because we've seen a little bit of increased pressure on President Biden to actually declare Atlanta as the host city for the 2024 Democratic National Convention. There are a lot of different factors at play, whether or not the National Democratic Party wants to hold a convention in a state that is governed by Republicans as opposed to in Illinois, Chicago, or state of New York City. Over the past weekend, civil rights leaders in Atlanta wrote a letter to President Biden basically telling him to, quote, put his money where his mouth is and declare Atlanta as the 2024 DNC site. How do you see this playing out over the next couple of weeks? We don't know. An announcement could be coming any day now.
Right. Well, the difficulty is, of course, President Biden is, as of to my knowledge, if you know differently, please let me know. I don't think he's a declared candidate yet. And so, right. And so, but of course, my strong impression is that he's going to run. So I think that Biden's in a tough spot because if he was the declared presidential nominee, then I think he could do this and it wouldn't be a big deal. But by doing this now, it just creates some workflow issues for that kind of thing. I don't know. That's just something to think about. But, the bottom line is that it would be a big deal for Atlanta because it's a huge convention. It's going to bring thousands upon thousands of people here. There's a lot of flights, a lot of restaurants, convention space, all that kind of thing. So economically, it's always good. But I think that there is a political calculus at play here. Conventions are designed to on television to sort of raise the profile of the candidate. But in the convention itself, they're supposed to rally the troops and energize the base and get people excited for the fall campaign. So I think there is some logic to the idea that, you would want to go to sort of your home turf, quote unquote. Georgia's competitive. But if you wanted to say it leaned one way or the other, I think there's good evidence to suggest Georgia leans to the right. It's much more competitive than it was even 5 years ago. But I think, these days, it would be a more Republican state than Democratic. But there's also some value to sort of saying, hey, we won Georgia last time. We're going to go for it again. And this is an example of it. So it makes sense in both ways, thinking about it from both sides. But I think, the other thing to consider is what is going to make the biggest splash for news, right? Because a lot of these announcements are made for newsworthiness and how much of the attention of the 24 news cycle can you give? And so I think Atlanta makes sense on that front. And again, then we can see clips from the 88 convention, right? That was exciting. We could see the worst convention speech in history, which was Bill Clinton's at the time, governor of Arkansas, things like that. So those are always fun things to think about, trips down memory lane. So
it is, and it's fun to talk politics, and this has just been a great and wonderful conversation. Thanks to Dr. Ben Taylor, professor of political science at Kennesaw State University, and thanks to all of you for watching this week's edition of Political Update on Atlanta News First.